Elara traced the crack in her porcelain mug, a fine gray line that mapped a geography of scarcity. It was her only mug, a survivor of 2 moves and a dozen near disasters. The coffee inside was weak and bitter, a pale imitation of the real thing, but its warmth was a small, defiant comfort against the morning chill that seeped through the window frame. Her world was a collection of such things, worn, cracked, and just barely holding on. The small apartment she shared with her grandmother was a museum of quiet desperation. The wallpaper peeled in long, sad strips, revealing the plaster beneath like old wounds. The floorboards groaned with the weight of every step, their complaints a constant soundtrack to Elara's life. She worked as a cleaner at a downtown office building, a ghost who moved through the world of others after they had gone home. She polished their desks, emptied their bins filled with discarded gourmet lunch wrappers, and breathed in the expensive silence of their ambition. Her own ambition was much simpler, much more urgent. It was folded into the thin, worn bills she tucked away each week. Her motivation had a name, Amelia. Her grandmother was a fragile bird of a woman, her body slowly succumbing to an illness that required medicine with a price tag that felt like a mountain. Amelia spent most of her days in a threadbare armchair, her breath a shallow whisper, her eyes holding a universe of love and apology. She apologized for the burden, for the cost, for the youth Elara was spending on her. "Don't you worry about me, my sweet girl," Amelia would say, her voice as thin as spun silk. "You should be out there, living." But Elara knew there was no life for her beyond these walls, not while her grandmother's life was tethered to a pharmacy bill. So she scrubbed floors, polished chrome, and collected her meager wages with a quiet dignity that was her only real possession. Her one indulgence, her single act of defiant beauty, was a small window box. In it she grew a handful of herbs, rosemary, thyme, and mint. Their stubborn greenery was a splash of life against the grimy brick of the alley outside, a promise that even in the harshest conditions, something could still grow. One Tuesday, a stark white envelope broke the monotony of brown bills and junk mail. It was not addressed in a friendly scrawl, but in a cold, severe font. The paper was thick, expensive, and felt alien in her hands. It was an eviction notice. The words were brutal and direct. The building had been sold. It was scheduled for demolition in 30 days to make way for a new luxury condominium tower called the Croft Ascendancy. All tenants were to vacate the premises. There was no negotiation, no offer of relocation. It was a death sentence for their tiny, fragile world. The name at the bottom of the page was Silas Croft, CEO of Croft Development. The name meant nothing to Elara, but the power behind it felt immense, an invisible tidal wave that was about to sweep her and her grandmother away. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Where would they go? Their meager savings were a dam against a flood of medical bills, not a bridge to a new home. The city was an ocean of luxury they could not afford to swim in. That evening, as the shadows grew long in their small living room, Amelia seemed to sense the shift in the air. The usual quiet was now heavy, suffocating. She looked at Elara, her eyes clear and strangely focused. "Come here, child," she whispered, patting the stool beside her chair. Elara knelt, her head bowed, the weight of the eviction notice pressing down on her. Amelia's hand, gnarled and frail, reached out and stroked her hair. "Your grandfather?" Amelia began, her voice gaining a surprising strength. He was a planner. He always worried about the wolves of the world. She directed Elara to a loose floorboard beneath her own chair, a secret Elara had never known existed. Tucked inside the dark space was a small, lacquered wooden box. Inside the box, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, sealed envelope. It was old, the paper yellowed and brittle, addressed to Elara in her grandfather's elegant looping script. "He gave this to me before he passed," Amelia explained. "He said, 'Give this to Elara only when the wolves are at the door, not a moment before.'" Amelia's eyes glistened. "I think I can hear them howling, my dear." Elara's grandfather, Julian, had been a botanist. He was a quiet, gentle man who saw miracles in soil and seeds. He had died when Elara was just a child, leaving behind memories of calloused hands that smelled of earth and a library of books filled with pressed flowers. He had been brilliant, people said, but forgotten by time. With trembling fingers, Elara broke the wax seal. Inside was not money, but 2 documents. The first was an official-looking deed, granting ownership of a 1-acre plot of land to Elara upon her 21st birthday. The land was in a place called Black Creek Valley, an industrial wasteland on the city's forgotten fringe. The second was a single sheet of paper, a cryptic note written in Julian's hand. It read, "My dearest Elara, wealth is not found, it is grown. Where the world sees only dust, a wise heart sees a dormant garden. The soil remembers what the world forgets. When all else is lost, trust the earth. Follow the sorrowful mother. Follow the sorrowful mother." The words made no sense. The deed felt like a cruel joke. A plot of barren land was no salvation. It was a patch of dirt, a final, dusty insult. But it was all they had. It was a key, however strange, given to her by a man who had loved her. The 30 days passed in a blur of packing their few possessions into cardboard boxes and saying goodbye to the only home Elara had ever really known. The other tenants, equally lost and desperate, shuffled out like ghosts, their lives upended by a signature on a piece of paper. On the final day, Elara hired a small, sputtering truck to take them and their boxes to Black Creek Valley. The driver, a kind man with a sad smile, looked at the address with pity. "There's nothing out there, miss," he said gently. "Just old factories and dust." He was right. Black Creek Valley was a graveyard of industrial dreams. Rusted skeletons of abandoned factories clawed at the sky. The creek that gave the area its name was a sluggish brown ribbon of water, and there, marked by 4 crumbling stone posts, was their acre. It was a desolate square of cracked, pale earth. A few stubborn weeds clung to life, their leaves coated in a fine gray dust. The air tasted of metal and decay. There was no shelter, no water, no hope. It was a landscape of absolute despair. Amelia, wrapped in a thick blanket despite the oppressive heat, looked at the barren plot from the truck's passenger seat. A single tear traced a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. Elara's heart shattered. She had brought her dying grandmother to a wasteland to die. As the truck pulled away, leaving them with their pathetic pile of boxes under the vast, indifferent sky, Elara felt a wave of hopelessness so profound it almost brought her to her knees. The world had chewed them up and spit them out onto this forgotten patch of nothing. But then she looked at her grandmother's face, at the quiet trust in her eyes. She thought of her grandfather's note. The soil remembers what the world forgets. She knelt down and touched the ground. It was dry and hard like stone. It felt dead. Yet, as her fingers dug into the parched dirt, she saw it. Tucked beside one of the stone posts, almost invisible, was a single tiny wildflower. It was a deep, impossible shade of purple, its petals delicate but defiant. It was a flicker of life in a world of death. Elara didn't know its name, but she recognized its courage. It was a sorrowful mother, a lone plant nurturing its seeds in a hostile world. A strange feeling, not quite hope, but a flicker of something like it, sparked within her. This was the spot. This was where she had to begin. She set up a small tent for her grandmother, gave her some water, and then, with a small spade from her window box supplies, Elara began to dig. A few days later, a convoy of sleek black cars kicked up a storm of dust as it rolled to a stop on the road beside her plot. The doors opened, and out stepped a man who seemed to suck all the color from the landscape. He wore a tailored suit of charcoal gray, his shoes gleaming with a polish that seemed offensive in this dusty world. His hair was slicked back, and a cruel smile was fixed on his face. He was an apex predator, and this was his hunting ground. It was Silas Croft. He was flanked by a group of sycophants, men in similar suits who laughed a little too loudly at his quiet remarks. They were here to survey the adjacent land, the next canvas for his concrete empire. Silas's eyes, cold and gray like pebbles in a frozen stream, scanned the bleak horizon. He spoke loudly, his voice dripping with arrogance, a performance for his entourage. He pointed out where the reflecting pools would go, where the private heliport would sit, completely ignoring the rusted factory husks as if his vision alone could erase them. Then his gaze fell upon the pathetic sight on the neighboring acre, a small tent, a pile of cardboard boxes, and a young woman digging in the dirt. He paused. His cruel smile widened into a sneer of genuine amusement. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice carrying easily across the dead air. "What have we here? A homesteader?" His followers chuckled, a chorus of obedient hyenas. Silas Croft walked toward the stone post that marked the edge of Elara's property. He stopped just short of it, careful not to let the dust of her world touch his expensive shoes. He looked down at Elara, who had straightened up, her face smudged with dirt, her hands raw. He looked at the frail old woman watching from the tent. He looked at the pathetic hole she had been digging. "Let me guess," he said, his voice a venomous purr. "You must be one of the former residents of my building. I should have known the vermin would scurry somewhere close by." The insult, so casual and dehumanizing, struck Elara like a physical blow. She stood her ground, her chin held high, the spade clutched in her hand like a weapon. "This is my land," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Silas let out a short, barking laugh. "Your land?" He gestured around at the desolation. "Congratulations! You are the queen of nothing, the empress of dust." His eyes then caught the small, vibrant splash of purple by the post, the wildflower. He bent down, a flicker of genuine interest in his eyes. He recognized it from a botanical auction catalog. It was rare, but out here it was just a weed. His gaze shifted to the small, tender seedlings Elara had just planted nearby, using seeds from her own small collection. "What is this?" he mocked, pointing a polished shoe at her work. "Are you trying to start a farm here, in this chemical toilet of a valley?" He turned to his men. "She thinks she's a gardener on land so toxic it would kill a cockroach." The laughter was louder this time, more vicious. It echoed in the oppressive heat, a soundtrack to her humiliation. Silas seemed to feed on it, his arrogance swelling. He looked back at Alara, his eyes glinting with a sadistic power. He saw her not as a person, but as an opportunity for entertainment. "I'll tell you what," he announced, his voice booming for the benefit of the local news reporter he'd brought to document his grand vision. "I'm a benevolent man. I appreciate ambition, however misguided." He gestured grandly at the Barren plot. "I will make you a bet, a public spectacle." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, mocking whisper that the reporter's microphone picked up perfectly. "You seem to think you can grow something here, so let's see it. Make this wasteland bloom. Produce something of actual monetary value from this pile of dirt." His smile was a slash of predatory glee. "You have 1 month. If, in 1 month, you can dig up anything from this soil that an independent appraiser values at even $1,000, I will give you $1 million, cold, hard cash." A gasp went through his entourage. The reporter scribbled furiously, "But," Silas continued, his voice turning hard as steel, "when you fail, and you will fail, you will sign the deed to this pathetic acre over to me. For the symbolic price of $1, I'll absorb it into my project and erase this little embarrassment from the map." He straightened up, triumphant. The bet was absurd, impossible. It was not a challenge. It was a public execution of her hope. He was building a narrative for the news. The mighty Silas Croft, toying with a desperate squatter before benevolently absorbing her useless land. Alara looked at his smug face, at the mocking laughter of his men. She looked at the tent where her grandmother sat, a silent witness to her granddaughter's degradation. She looked down at the deed in her pocket, and she thought of her grandfather's words, "When the wolves are at the door." The wolf was here. He was smiling. He was offering her a cage disguised as a prize. Something inside her, a quiet, resilient thing that had endured years of hardship, did not break. It hardened. The fear that had been a cold knot in her stomach was suddenly burned away by a clean, white-hot anger. The humiliation was a fire, forging her resolve. She met Silas Croft's gaze. Her eyes, which had been downcast and weary, were now clear and sharp. "You have a deal," she said. The words were spoken without a tremor. They hung in the air, shockingly firm. Silas's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, surprised by her lack of pleading or tears. Then it returned, wider and more contemptuous than before. "Excellent!" he boomed. "Let the games begin. Don't forget to water your dust." He turned and strode back to his car, his pack of hyenas following, their cruel laughter trailing behind him like a foul stench. The convoy of black cars sped away, leaving Alara alone once more in a cloud of dust and derision. The war had begun. In the suffocating silence that followed, Alara did not feel despair. She felt a strange, electric calm. The public challenge meant to destroy her had instead given her a weapon, a deadline, a stage. She walked back to the spot by the stone post, to the tiny purple wildflower. Follow the sorrowful mother, her grandfather's cryptic clue. It wasn't a metaphor. It was an instruction. She looked closely at the flower. It was a species of crocus, but one she had never seen before. Its color was unnaturally deep, its stigma a fiery crimson red. It was the sorrowful mother, a single, lonely plant. And her grandfather had told her to follow it. She took out the second document from the envelope, the note. On the back, which she hadn't noticed before, was a faint drawing, almost invisible. It was a map, but it was not a map of roads or landmarks. It was a map of the soil itself. It showed a cross-section of the earth beneath her feet, with layers of different compositions: clay, sand, gravel. And it showed a path, a route to dig, starting directly beneath the sorrowful mother. The drawing was annotated with strange instructions. Dig 3 feet down through the clay seal. Turn west at the iron-rich strata. Listen for the hollow sound. It was a treasure map, but the treasure was buried in geology. For the next few weeks, Alara worked with a feverish intensity. The world outside ceased to exist. There were no more mocking magnates, no looming deadlines, only the earth and the instructions of a long-dead genius. She bought a sturdy shovel and a pickaxe with the last of her emergency money. She dug. The first few feet were brutal, compacted clay that fought her every move. Her hands blistered, then bled, then formed calluses. Her muscles screamed in protest. Each night she would collapse in her tent, exhausted, sharing a simple meal of canned beans with Amelia, who watched her with a mixture of fear and profound pride. "Your grandfather would be so proud," Amelia whispered one night, her voice filled with awe. "You have his hands, his spirit." Alara followed the map precisely. She hit the iron-rich layer, a vein of red earth that ran like a buried river. As instructed, she turned west, digging a trench. The work was slow, painstaking. A few curious locals from the nearby run-down town would sometimes stop and watch the strange girl digging a trench in the middle of nowhere. They thought she was mad, driven to it by poverty and grief. Then, on the 27th day, her shovel struck something that wasn't rock or dirt. It made a dull, hollow thud. Listen for the hollow sound. Her heart hammered against her ribs. With trembling hands, she carefully cleared the dirt away. What she uncovered was not a chest of gold or a box of jewels. It was a series of large, sealed clay pots, arranged in a precise circle. They were ancient-looking, covered in a waxy black substance that had kept them perfectly preserved. Each pot was marked with a symbol, the same stylized crocus flower as the one growing on the surface. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the legacy her grandfather had buried. With immense care, she lifted one of the smaller pots from the earth. It was heavy, solid. She carried it to the tent, her hands shaking so much she was afraid she would drop it. Using the edge of her spade, she carefully chipped away at the wax seal. It cracked open with a soft hiss, releasing a scent of dry earth and something else, something floral, spicy, and impossibly rich. Inside, packed in a dry, nutrient-rich soil medium, were not jewels, but bulbs, hundreds of them perfectly dormant. And in a separate sealed glass vial within the pot was a collection of seeds, dark and tiny, like specks of night. Next to it was a folded waterproof parchment. She unrolled it. It was a note from her grandfather, Julian. "Alara, if you are reading this, you have found my life's true work. These are not ordinary crocuses. This is Crocus julianus, a strain I cultivated over decades. It is a hybrid, extinct in the wild, that produces saffron of a quality the world has never seen. Its threads are 20 times more potent, its medicinal properties beyond measure. I hid it here, in this soil I spent years preparing to protect it from the greed of men like the Crofts. The soil is not toxic. It is a perfectly balanced cradle. The sorrowful mother on the surface is the last of the original line, a living beacon I planted to guide you. This is your inheritance, not wealth, but a chance to bring something beautiful and healing back into the world. Grow it, share it, let it be your legacy, not mine. Tears streamed down Alara's face, washing away the dirt and grime. It wasn't about money. It was about life. It was about a secret garden, a genetic ark, hidden from a world that would only see it as a commodity. Her grandfather hadn't abandoned them to a wasteland. He had led them to a sanctuary. The final day of the month arrived. The sun was high and brutal. A small crowd had gathered. The local news was back, along with a few online bloggers who had caught wind of the bizarre public bet. They all expected a final, pathetic spectacle. At precisely noon, Silas Croft's black car arrived. He stepped out, looking smug and victorious. He had brought an appraiser with him, a stern-looking man in a gray suit, and a botanist, a fussy academic named Dr. Alastair Finch, to officially declare the land barren. Silas strode to the edge of the plot, his smile a mask of false sympathy. "Well, my dear," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "The month is up. Time to pay the piper. I have the $1 bill right here. And the deed transfer papers, of course." He expected to see her standing defeated amidst the dust. Instead, he saw something that made him stop dead. In the center of the plot, where the trench had been, Alara had created a small, irrigated patch of earth, and from that earth, a small but vibrant patch of the deepest, most luminous purple flowers he had ever seen had bloomed. They seemed to drink the harsh sunlight and radiate it back as pure color. The air around them hummed with a strange energy. Silas's smile froze on his face. His eyes narrowed. "What is this? A cheap trick? You planted flowers you bought at a market?" "These grew here," Alara said, her voice calm and clear. It carried an authority that stunned him into silence. Dr. Finch, the botanist, pushed past Silas, his professional curiosity overriding his allegiance. He knelt beside the patch of flowers, his eyes widening in disbelief. He gently touched a petal, then examined the fiery red stigma of one of the crocuses. He took out a magnifying glass, his hands beginning to tremble. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice cracking. He looked up at Silas, his face pale with shock and awe. This is not just a crocus. This is the Julian crocus, Crocus julianus." Silas stared at him, uncomprehending. "The what? Speak English, you fool!" "It's a legend," Finch exclaimed, his academic composure shattering. "A lost strain. Julian Maynard, the botanist, was said to have perfected it before he died. It's been a myth, a holy grail for botanists for 20 years. The saffron it produces, the potency. It was rumored to have incredible medicinal applications. It could revolutionize treatments for neurodegenerative diseases. Its value is incalculable." The appraiser, who had been looking bored, was now listening intently. The news reporter's camera was focused squarely on the botanist's astonished face. Silas's face, which had been a mask of arrogant amusement, began to crumble. The blood drained from it, leaving a sickly, pale complexion. The laughter of his entourage had died. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic scribbling of the reporter and the stunned gasps of the onlookers. "Incalculable?" Silas repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "The patent for a strain like this, the exclusive rights to cultivate it." Finch was rambling, lost in a daze of scientific ecstasy. "It wouldn't be millions, it would be hundreds of millions, potentially billions." Alara stood there watching him. She held up the small clay pot with the remaining bulbs. "I have more," she said quietly. "A lot more." And the deed to this land, which my grandfather registered as a private botanical sanctuary 30 years ago under the Heritage Flora Act. The appraiser stepped forward. His demeanor completely changed. He was no longer looking at a poor girl, but at the owner of a biological treasure. "A registered sanctuary?" he asked, his voice full of a newfound respect. "That changes things. Any development on adjacent land would be subject to extreme environmental impact studies. It could halt construction for years." The foundation of Silas Croft's world began to crack. His grand project, the Croft Ascendancy, was planned for the land directly next to this plot. A botanical sanctuary, especially for a priceless, one-of-a-kind species, would tie his project up in so much red tape it would bankrupt him before the first brick was laid. He looked from the flowers to Alara's calm, resolute face. The girl he had dismissed as vermin, as dust. The bet he had made to humiliate her had backfired in the most spectacular, catastrophic way imaginable. He had publicly offered her $1 million for producing something of value. She had produced a biological Fort Knox. His arrogant smile was gone, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The man who always had the last cruel word was finally utterly speechless. The laughter had frozen. The silence was his defeat. The news of the miracle in Black Creek Valley spread like wildfire. The story was irresistible. The humble, evicted girl who turned her patch of wasteland into a botanical gold mine, humiliating the arrogant billionaire who tried to crush her. Alara was no longer a ghost. She was a sensation. The botanist, Dr. Finch, now freed from Silas's influence, became her most vocal champion. He published a preliminary paper on the Julian crocus, confirming its authenticity and unparalleled genetic makeup. The scientific community was in an uproar. Universities and pharmaceutical companies began a frantic bidding war, not to buy the land, but to partner with Alara in researching and cultivating the legendary saffron. But the sanctuary status was the real masterstroke. As the appraiser had predicted, it brought Silas Croft's development project to a grinding halt. The Planning Commission put an immediate and indefinite freeze on all building permits for the entire valley, pending a full environmental review. The Croft Ascendancy was dead on arrival. The initial shock for Silas quickly morphed into a rabid, cornered fury. He was a man who had never lost, and he refused to be defeated by a girl and a handful of flowers. He launched his counterattack. His first move was to try and discredit the discovery. He used his media contacts to plant stories suggesting Alara was a fraud, that she had somehow faked the flowers, or that Dr. Finch had been paid off. But Finch, a man whose reputation was his entire world, fought back with a ferocious academic zeal, presenting undeniable scientific proof. The mud Silas slung refused to stick. Then an unexpected figure emerged from the past. An elderly man with kind eyes and a sharply tailored but old-fashioned suit appeared at Alara's tent one afternoon. He introduced himself as Mr. Abel, a lawyer. "I was your grandfather's attorney," he said, his voice warm and steady. "And his friend. He made me promise to watch over you from a distance, and to step in only when you had proven yourself worthy of his legacy. By finding the garden, you have done just that." Mr. Abel was the keeper of the secret. He had been waiting for this moment for 20 years. He placed a heavy leather-bound satchel on the makeshift table outside the tent. "This," he said, his hand resting on the satchel, is the rest of your inheritance, your grandfather's ammunition. Inside were Julian's personal journals, dozens of them, filled with his elegant script and detailed botanical drawings. But they contained more than just scientific observations. They told a story of a partnership with a man named Marcus Croft, Silas's father. The journals detailed, with meticulous evidence, how Marcus Croft had systematically stolen Julian's research. Patents for drought-resistant grains, pest-resistant crops, and innovative horticultural techniques that were now the very foundation of the Croft Corporation's agricultural and pharmaceutical divisions. They were all Julian's work. Marcus had cheated him, pushed him out of their shared company, and built an empire on the fruits of Julian's genius, leaving the brilliant botanist to die in obscurity. The connection was staggering. This was not a random conflict. It was the final battle in a war that had begun a generation ago. The saffron crocus was the one masterpiece Julian had managed to hide from the Croft family's greed. "Your grandfather wasn't just a botanist, Alara," Mr. Abel said gently. "He was a warrior. He knew Silas was cut from the same rotten cloth as his father. He knew that one day their greed would lead them back here. This land, this sanctuary, it wasn't just a garden, it was a trap, and Silas Croft has walked right into it." As news of Julian's journals began to leak, the silent army started to gather. An elderly professor from the state university, one of Julian's first students, came forward. He had letters from Julian describing the betrayal by Marcus Croft in vivid, painful detail. A group of farmers from the dry plains to the west contacted Mr. Abel. They explained how, 30 years ago, their farms were on the brink of collapse due to a devastating drought. A quiet, unassuming botanist named Julian Maynard had visited them, giving them a new strain of wheat he had developed, a strain that required almost no water. It had saved their farms, their families, their entire town. They had never forgotten. They were ready to testify. The most damning piece of evidence came from a redeemed witness, a woman who had worked for years as a senior archivist at the Croft Corporation. She had been tasked by Silas himself years ago to find and destroy any documents linking the company's early patents to Julian Maynard. Horrified by the order, she had instead made digital copies of everything before wiping the originals. She had lived in fear for years, but seeing Alara's story on the news gave her the courage to come forward. She delivered a USB drive to Mr. Abel, containing a mountain of incriminating evidence. Silas Croft, meanwhile, was becoming more unhinged. He filed a frivolous lawsuit, hiring a team of ruthless lawyers to claim that the soil of the sanctuary was dangerously contaminated from the old factories and posed a public health risk. His plan was to get a court order to remediate the land, which would involve stripping the topsoil and destroying the entire crocus colony. He tried to intimidate the witnesses. The old professor received veiled threats about his university funding. The farmers were visited by aggressive lawyers questioning their land titles. Mr. Abel's office was broken into, a clumsy attempt to find the journals. But the threats only strengthened their resolve. The small band of allies, united by their shared respect for a good man long dead, closed ranks around Alara. They were her grandfather's silent army, a legacy of good deeds returning to fight one last battle. The conflict had escalated far beyond a simple bet. It was now a full-blown war for Julian's legacy, a moral reckoning that threatened to bring the entire Croft empire crashing down. The stage was set for a final public confrontation where everything would be laid bare. The final showdown was convened not in a courtroom, but in the grand chamber of the Regional Planning Commission. The emergency hearing was ostensibly about zoning, specifically Silas Croft's application to have the botanical sanctuary designation overturned and Alara's land condemned as a toxic hazard. But everyone in the packed room knew it was about much more. The chamber was a theater of power. On one side sat Silas Croft, flanked by a phalanx of shark-like lawyers from the city's most expensive firm. He had regained some of his composure, now encased in a shell of cold reptilian fury. He believed his money and legal might were an invincible shield. His investors sat behind him, their faces grim, their fortunes hanging in the balance. On the other side sat Alara. She was no longer the dirt-smudged girl in rags. She wore a simple but elegant dress, a gift from the grateful farmers. Beside her was the quiet, dignified Mr. Abel. Behind them sat her silent army, the elderly professor, the weathered farmers, and the pale but resolute former archivist. In the back of the room, Amelia sat in a wheelchair, her presence a source of quiet strength for Alara. The media was there in force, their cameras and microphones poised to capture every moment. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Silas's lead counsel, a man with a silver tongue and no conscience, began the proceedings. He presented what he believed was their unbeatable final gambit. With a polished and persuasive presentation, he laid out a case built on a mountain of fabricated data. "Ladies and gentlemen of the Commission," he began, his voice smooth as oil, "we are not here to dispute the sentimental value of a few flowers. We are here to discuss public safety." He projected a series of complex charts and graphs onto a large screen. "Our independent geological surveys conducted by the esteemed firm GeoSolutions have found alarming levels of lead, arsenic, and hexavalent chromium in the soil of Plot 7B, the so-called sanctuary. This land is not a garden, it is a ticking toxic time bomb." He presented a forged report, thick and glossy, filled with falsified soil sample results. He argued that the only responsible course of action was an immediate and total remediation, a process that would involve excavating the land and incinerating the contaminated soil. It was a neat, legalistic way to murder a garden. "Furthermore," the lawyer continued, "we have found that the original trust filed by Mr. Maynard was legally flawed. It lacks a specific perpetuity clause required by the 1988 revision of the Heritage Flora Act. It is, therefore, null and void." He smiled, a thin, triumphant slash. It seemed like a perfect trap. He had a public health crisis and a legal loophole. When he finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. Silas Croft allowed himself a small, smug smile. He had them. He would destroy the girl, the garden, and the memory of the man his father had cheated, all under the respectable guise of civic duty. The commission chair, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Albright, turned to Alara. "Miss Maynard, do you have a response?" Alara stood up. The room was utterly silent. She did not look at the lawyers or the charts. She looked directly at the commission members. She was no longer timid, no longer invisible. The fire of her grandfather's legacy burned in her eyes. "My name is Alara Maynard," she began, her voice clear and steady, needing no microphone. "I am not a lawyer or a scientist. I am a gardener, and I am the granddaughter of a great man whose name was stolen. She did not try to refute their data with her own. Instead, she told a story. She spoke of her grandfather, Julian, and his love for the earth. She spoke of his partnership with Marcus Croft and his subsequent betrayal. She told the commission about the eviction, the barren plot of land, and the cryptic note that led her to a hidden legacy. Her words were simple, honest, and powerful. She was not presenting a case. She was bearing witness to the truth. When she finished, Mr. Abel rose. The Croft Corporation has presented a report from a firm called Geo Solutions, he said calmly. It may interest the Commission to know that Geo Solutions is a shell corporation, wholly owned by Croft Development. Their report is not an independent analysis, it is a work of fiction. He then placed a different report on the table. This is from the university's own geology department, who took samples last week. It confirms that the soil is not only clean, but uniquely balanced. It is, as Dr. Finch has stated, a masterpiece of horticultural engineering. Then came the counterattack. It was not a barrage, but a series of precise, devastating strikes. Mr. Abel called his first witness, Professor Davies, Julian's old student. The professor, with tears in his eyes, read from the letters Julian had sent him, his voice trembling with righteous anger as he described the theft of his life's work. He authenticated the journals, confirming Julian's handwriting and the scientific brilliance within them. Next came one of the farmers, a man with a face like a road map of hardship. He told the story of the drought-resistant wheat. Julian Maynard didn't ask for a patent or a penny, the farmer said, his voice thick with emotion. He saved my town. Silas Croft's father built an empire on stolen seeds, while the man who created them gave them away for free. That's the difference between a legacy and a balance sheet. The final blow came from the redeemed archivist. Mr. Abel called her to the stand. Visibly nervous but resolute, she explained her role at the Croft Corporation. Mr. Croft ordered me to purge the archives of Julian Maynard's name, she stated clearly. He called it sanitizing the historical record. I knew it was wrong. Mr. Abel held up a small USB drive. She made copies, he announced to the stunned room. Contained on this drive are internal company emails, original patent drafts in Julian Maynard's own hand, and a memo from Silas Croft himself, dated 6 months ago, outlining a plan to acquire the worthless Maynard plot to bury that ghost for good. He submitted the drive as evidence. The room erupted. The investors behind Silas were now on their phones, their faces ashen. They were not just witnessing a zoning dispute. They were witnessing the public demolition of a corporate giant built on a foundation of lies. The reporters were in a frenzy. Mrs. Albright, the commission chair, banged her gavel for order. Her face was a mask of cold fury. She and the other commission members had been lied to, their intelligence insulted. They conferred for only a moment, their decision swift and unanimous. The Commission finds the claims of soil toxicity to be fraudulent and malicious, Mrs. Albright declared, her voice ringing with authority. The sanctuary status of Plot 7B is hereby affirmed and granted permanent, irrevocable protection. She wasn't finished. Furthermore, based on the credible evidence of widespread systematic fraud presented today, this commission will be filing a formal request with the Attorney General's office to launch a full-scale criminal investigation into the business practices and patent history of the Croft Corporation. It was a complete and total annihilation. Silas Croft, sat frozen in his chair. The shield of his wealth had shattered. The legal trap he had set had snapped shut on him instead. He looked around at the faces of his lawyers who refused to meet his gaze. He saw his investors turning their backs on him. He saw the flash of cameras capturing his ruin. He had been brought down not by a corporate raider or a market crash, but by a gardener, a handful of old letters, and the enduring loyalty a good man had inspired decades ago. Without a word, he rose from his chair. His arrogance, his power, his cruel smile, all of it had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, defeated shell of a man. He walked out of the chamber not with a roar of defiance, but in a dead, suffocating silence. He was utterly, publicly, and irrevocably alone. The harvest of his greed was complete. In the quiet aftermath of the hearing, the first thing Elara did was take her grandmother home, not to the tent in the dusty valley, but to a small sunlit house with a garden in the back. It was a comfortable, modest home, paid for with the advance from a pharmaceutical company that had won the bid to partner with her, a partnership based on ethical research and profit sharing, not exploitation. The day they moved in, Amelia sat in a plush armchair by a large window overlooking the blooming garden. For the first time in years, her breathing was easy. The best doctors, funded by the new foundation, were managing her illness, giving her a peace she hadn't known was possible. Elara knelt beside her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, the dam of years of pent-up fear, struggle, and pain finally broke. Elara laid her head in her grandmother's lap and wept. They were not tears of sadness, but of release, a cleansing rain after a long drought. Amelia stroked her hair, her own silent tears falling onto Elara's head. The wounds of the past, deep and festering, were finally beginning to heal. Elara's victory was not a private one. She felt the weight of her grandfather's true legacy, and she knew what she had to do. Her first major act was not one of personal indulgence. With the initial substantial payment from the saffron patent, she established the Julian Maynard Foundation for Ethical Botany. Its mission was to fund small independent researchers and to provide grants to struggling family farms, the very people her grandfather had dedicated his life to helping. Her next act was more personal. She obtained a list of all the other tenants who had been evicted from her old apartment building. Most were scattered across the city, struggling in precarious living situations. One by one, Elara found them. She paid off their moving debts, covered their security deposits for new, stable homes, and for those who had incurred medical bills due to the stress, she paid those too. She didn't want a parade or an article in the paper. She did it quietly, an anonymous act of solidarity. She was repaying a debt not of money, but of shared hardship. A week after they had settled into the new house, Mr. Abel paid them a visit. He carried a single, final envelope. "Your grandfather left one last letter," he explained, his eyes twinkling. "He instructed me to give it to you only after the storm had passed and the garden was safe." Elara took the letter. The paper was crisp, the handwriting firm. It was not a message from the distant past, but a conversation meant for this very moment. "My dearest Elara," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have done more than find my hidden work. You have unearthed its soul. You have faced the wolf, and you have shown him that a garden is more powerful than a fortress. I did not leave you this legacy to make you rich. Wealth, my child, is a dangerous soil. It can grow wonders, or it can grow poison. The Croft family believed wealth was a weapon. something to be hoarded and used to dominate others. They built an empire of walls. But true legacy is not a wall. It is a seed. It is something that grows, that spreads, that feeds more than just its owner. The saffron is a miracle, yes. But the true miracle is a heart that chooses to share it. The money it brings is a tool, nothing more. Use it to plant other gardens, to nurture other dreamers, to build bridges where others have built walls. Your victory is not in defeating Silas Croft, but in choosing not to become him. Do not let this power change the humble, kind girl who grew herbs in a window box. That girl is my true heir. Her heart is the most fertile ground of all. I am proud of you. Now go and make the world bloom. With all my love, your grandfather, Julian. Elara folded the letter, her heart full to bursting. The final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. She understood. Her grandfather hadn't just given her a fortune. He had given her a compass. The moral victory was not just in winning, but in how she would carry that victory forward. She looked out at her new garden, at the sunlight dappling the leaves. She felt a profound sense of peace. The work was just beginning. 10 years later, the barren plot in Black Creek Valley was unrecognizable. It was now the heart of the Maynard Institute for Botanical Research, a world-renowned center for sustainable agriculture and phytomedicine. The once desolate land was a lush tapestry of greenhouses, research labs, and public gardens. The air, once tasting of rust and decay, now smelled of damp earth and blooming flowers. The Institute provided free education to local students and developed open-source agricultural patents for developing nations. It was a living monument to Julian's philosophy. Elara was not a CAEO in a high-rise office. She was still a gardener. She was the Institute's founder and guiding spirit, but she was most often found with her hands in the soil, teaching a class of children about companion planting or working alongside the world's top scientists to cultivate a new strain of blight-resistant rice. She was respected, even revered, in the world of philanthropy, but she had never lost the quiet humility that was her core. She still drove a modest car and lived in the same sunlit house with her grandmother, who, against all odds, was still alive. Her health, sustained by the very medicine her grandfather's legacy had helped to fund. One crisp autumn afternoon, Elara was visiting a community garden in a low-income neighborhood on the other side of the city, a project funded by her foundation. She watched as families tended their small plots, their laughter a vibrant contrast to the gray concrete surrounding them. At a small market stand near the garden's entrance, she noticed a familiar scene. A young girl, no older than 12, was counting out a handful of coins, her face etched with worry. She was trying to buy a small packet of rare tomato seeds, but she was short. The vendor, a gruff, impatient man, was shaking his head dismissively. "Come on, kid, I haven't got all day," the vendor grumbled. "Either you have the money or you don't." The girl's shoulders slumped in defeat. Elara felt a powerful sense of déjà vu. She saw herself in that girl, her own past desperation, the sting of being dismissed, the feeling of a small, beautiful dream being just out of reach. She quietly walked up to the stand. "I'll take them," she said to the vendor, her voice gentle. "All of them." She bought every packet of seeds the vendor had. She then turned to the stunned girl and handed her the tomato seeds she had wanted, along with several others. The girl's eyes went wide. I can't pay you back," she stammered. Elara smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "You don't have to," she said. "A long time ago, someone believed in a small seed I was trying to plant. They gave me a chance when no one else would. It's only right to pass it on." She encouraged the girl to take the seeds and grow something beautiful. As the girl ran off, her face alight with joy, Alara felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. This was the true interest on her grandfather's investment. As for Silas Croft, his fate was a footnote in the story of his own downfall, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. After the criminal investigation exposed the full extent of the Croft Corporation's decades of fraud, the company collapsed in a storm of lawsuits and federal indictments. Silas lost everything: his fortune, his reputation, his empire. He was prosecuted, but due to a legal technicality, he avoided a long prison sentence. He ended up living in a cramped, run-down apartment on the edge of the city, not unlike the one he had once evicted Alara from. One of the farmers whose town Julian had saved, now the prosperous head of an agricultural cooperative, heard of Silas's plight. In an act of profound, almost unbelievable grace, he offered the disgraced magnate a job packing crates on a loading dock. Silas, his pride the only thing he had left, was too arrogant to accept charity from a man he still considered a peasant. He refused the offer. He was last seen as a ghost of a man, shuffling through the city, bitter and alone, haunted by the memory of a garden he had been too blind to see. Alara stood watching the sunset over the community garden, the laughter of children echoing around her. She had started with a single, defiant flower on a barren plot of land. She had dug up a secret worth millions, but had discovered a truth worth infinitely more. Her grandfather was right. She had planted a seed of kindness in a world of greed. The harvest would be eternal.